Nakajima had already built one 4-engine bomber. It was a disaster. But the company came out of it with real experience, bitter as that was, and the lesson starts, of all places, with an American airliner. In 1938, Douglas built a single prototype of a big 4-engine transport called the DC-4E. The American carriers turned it down. It was too heavy for its engines, too complicated, and too expensive to maintain. Douglas built a simpler airplane instead and reused the DC-4 name for it, so the original became the DC-4E, with the E standing for experimental. Only one was ever built, and in late 1939 it was sold to Japan. The buyer on paper was a Japanese airline. The real customer was the Imperial Navy, and the aircraft went straight to Nakajima. Shortly after the sale, Japanese newspapers reported that the DC-4E had crashed in Tokyo Bay. It had not. It was sitting in a Nakajima shop, being taken apart piece by piece. What Nakajima got for its money was an education in large aircraft. The Douglas had a 138-foot wing and 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, 1,450 horsepower apiece, and it was the first large aircraft in the world built with a nose wheel. The Navy requirement of the moment, the 13 She large land-based attack aircraft, asked for a bomber that could carry heavy loads of bombs or torpedoes a minimum of about 3,400 miles. Nakajima's answer, the G5N Shinzan, leaned hard on the Douglas. It kept the DC-4E's wing and engine arrangement, kept the American aircraft's overcomplicated systems along with them, then piled military equipment on top. The tail was one of the few things that changed. The Douglas had 3 fins, the Shinzan 2. It went wrong in every direction at once. The airframe came out more than 20% heavier than the projections. The engines, Nakajima's own 1,870 horsepower NK7A Mamoru 11s, never delivered their rated output, vibrated badly, and proved unreliable. Japan had never built anything this large. The Shinzan came out with too much weight and not enough power, and nobody at the company knew how to fix it. 6 Shinzans were built, and that was the end of it. The Allied reporting name was Liz. The Japanese had a harsher name for it than that, Baka Garasu, the idiot crow. Nakajima did not walk away from all that. It wrote down what it had learned, and the list reads like a design brief for the next aircraft. Use only engines and structural data already proven. Finish the research before you cut metal. Build with the technology you have, not improvements somebody has promised. Hold to the weight limit. Fit self-sealing tanks and superchargers. And use only materials you can actually get. Every one of those points shows up in the next aircraft. So does the man who wrote them. Kenichi Matsumura graduated from Tokyo Imperial University in 1932, joined Nakajima 2 years later, and had led the Shinzan. He would lead its replacement too. In late 1942, the Navy went looking for something to replace the aging G4M. 2 earlier attempts had already come and gone. Mitsubishi's G7M Taizan took the 16 She requirement in 1941. Kawanishi's K100 took the 17 She. Both were canceled in 1942, short of their specifications. The Navy felt their twin-engine design simply could not deliver the required combat performance. Kiro Honjo, the engineer who had drawn the G4M in the first place, originally laid out the Taizan with 4 engines. Navy Air Headquarters killed that idea the moment he raised it, and Honjo was pushed back into building another twin, essentially a bigger G4M, asked to get 360 miles an hour and 4,500 miles out of 2 engines. What finally opened the door to 4 was not a change of heart at headquarters, it was 2 consecutive failures. The Navy had already tipped its hand. In December 1942, it sent Nakajima an internal notice under the experimental plan number N40. In February 1943, the order came. Nakajima would build the new G8N. There was no competition. The 18 She land attack aircraft went to one company, unopposed. On July 27th, the program stopped being the 18 She experimental land-based attack aircraft and officially became the experimental Renzan mountain range. The official specification came down on September 14, 1943. The targets in it were not modest. They needed a top speed just under 370 miles an hour and a climb to 26,000 feet in under 20 minutes. Combat range had to reach 2,300 miles with a full 8,800-pound bomb load. With a reduced load, ferry range jumped to 4,600 miles. Those targets were already a retreat. At a Navy technical conference the year before, officers had discussed a long-range attacker that would do about 415 miles an hour and fly 6,900 miles with the same 8,800 pounds of bombs. By September 1943, that had been cut back to something Japanese industry might plausibly build. 370 miles an hour would still have put the Renzan about 80 miles an hour ahead of a B-17G or a B-24J, and within 10 of a B-29. It also had to defend itself in every direction at once. Cannon and heavy machine guns, no blind spots. And it had to be armored. The first weight estimates came back high. It was going to need a lot of engine. The numbers out of Matsumura's office at Nakajima's Koizumi plant in Gunma Prefecture described an aircraft just under 107 feet across the wing and about 75 feet long, empty at roughly 38,000 pounds, loaded to 59,000 with an overload figure just under 71,000. That is B-17 territory almost exactly. A B-17G's maximum takeoff weight was about 72,000 pounds. For the G8N1, they picked 4 Nakajima NK9KL Homare 24 radials. The Homare was a 35.8-liter, 18-cylinder twin-row air-cooled radial. 2,000 horsepower for takeoff, 1850 at 26,000 feet on paper. It demanded 92-octane fuel with water methanol injection, and that is where the trouble began. The Homare was designed very tight, and Japanese factories struggled to hold the tolerances it needed. In service, early Homers were making closer to 1,300 horsepower up there, whatever the data plate said. The same engine family powered the Ki-84, the N1K2J, and the P1Y Ginga, and all three suffered chronic serviceability problems. The Renzan needed 4 of them, all running at once. The engines were fitted with Hitachi Type 92 turbo superchargers and auxiliary cooling fans. Japanese work on turbos went back to 1937, when an officer posted to France arranged to import a sample unit from Brown Boveri in Switzerland. The Swiss unit had been built for 500 horsepower diesels and only had to survive exhaust temperatures around 900 degrees Fahrenheit. An aircraft engine burning gasoline pushes exhaust past 1,300. Everything Japan built afterward descended from a sample designed for the wrong job. Mitsubishi, Hitachi, and Ishikawajima took on the development. Nakajima declined and stayed with gear-driven superchargers, which meant the company building the Renzan had no turbo expertise of its own and had to take Hitachi's unit on faith. The high-temperature alloys you need for turbine blades and exhaust ducting were available to American industry in quantity and were not available to Japan, and General Electric had been quietly gathering turbine blade data for more than a decade. Japan was still flying on 87 and 91 octane gasoline in 1945, the same grades it started the war with, while American engines were running on 130 grade fuel. Out front were 4-blade constant-speed metal props copied from the German VDM design, built under license by Sumitomo 13 feet across. 4 powered turrets, nose, dorsal, ventral, and tail, plus a gun in each waist window. The exact fit was 6 20mm Type 99 cannon, paired 2 to a turret in the dorsal, ventral, and tail stations, plus 4 13mm Type 2 machine guns, 2 of them in the powered nose turret, and 1 in each waist position. The waist guns were handheld, everything else was power-operated. The Type 2 was a license-built copy of the German MG-131. Call it a 50 caliber, near enough. Underneath, the bomb bay could be loaded several ways: 1860-kilo bombs, about 130 pounds apiece, or a pair of 2,000-kilo weapons at 4,400 pounds each. It could also carry 2 torpedoes. The Navy's category for it was Rikujo Kogekiki, land-based attack aircraft. It was built to sink ships, not to burn cities. Sources cannot even agree on the crew. English accounts say 10 men, Japanese accounts say 7. To speed up production, the structure was cut back to the bone. The technique came off the G6N Shinzan and is known as thick plate construction. Instead of a thin skin held in shape by a dense grid of stringers, the Renzan used heavier gauge plate that carried the shear and bending loads itself. That deleted a large number of stringers and an enormous number of rivets from the fuselage and the wing, and left a smoother, faster surface as a bonus. Data from a captured B-17 taken in the South Pacific early in the war and stripped down for study is said to have fed into the structural work, though whether any of it actually reached the Renzan is a Japanese claim, not a documented fact. The wing was mid-mounted, deliberately small in area and high in aspect ratio, because the Navy wanted speed above everything, and it appears to have used a laminar flow section. A small wing is wonderful at 300 miles an hour and frightening at 80, so the Renzan got what the Japanese called parent and child flaps. A second, smaller flap riding behind the main one to pull the takeoff and landing speeds back down. Under all of it sat tricycle gear, still a rarity on Japanese aircraft. That nose wheel inherited straight down the line from the single Douglas prototype in the Nakajima shop. It carried a single fin and rudder, where the Shinzan had two. And the fuel tanks were self-sealing, with armor for the crew, precisely the things the G4M had gone to war without. If flight testing went smoothly, the plan was to build 48 G8N1s by September 1945. On top of those came 16 test and pre-production aircraft. For scale, Germany had already put its own troubled heavy, the Heinkel 177, 4 engines geared into 2 propellers, into production, and would build more than 1,160. Japan was talking about 64. The first G8N1 prototype was assembled in October 1944 and made its maiden flight on October 23rd. Construction had begun back on April 29th at Koizumi, the company's dedicated Navy airframe factory. The Navy ran formal structural tests on it 3 times as it went together, at half completion, at 3/4, and at 90%. Taxi trials began October 10th. 13 days later it flew. It came back with minor damage from the landing and nothing else. From the Navy's formal order to that first flight was 13 months, which sounds astonishing for a 4-engine bomber in wartime Japan. It was less of a miracle than it sounds. Under the Navy's experimental plan system, the study and mock-up reviews were done before the contract was signed, so the drawings and jigs were already waiting. The airplane flew the way the design office said it would, and by the standards of Japanese wartime programs, it had all gone unusually smoothly. The turbo problem, though, was never solved. The Hitachi units simply weren't finished when the airframe was. So the Renzan flew without them and was handed over to the Navy without them. It handled beautifully anyway. But a Homar with no exhaust turbine has no high-altitude performance, and high altitude was the entire point of the specification. So the figures in the reference books, just under 370 miles an hour, a ceiling around 33,000 feet, 26,000 feet in 17.5 minutes, came off a slide rule. They were calculated, not measured. The Navy had planned it partly that way. The first 3 prototypes were only ever meant to check handling and shake down the equipment. The real performance trials, with working turbos and the full defensive armament fitted, were scheduled for the 4th aircraft and the ones after it. The trials stopped there. Nobody ever measured what the Renzan actually did, not once. Delivery slipped, too. While the first prototype was being moved into its hangar, the brakes failed and it ran into something hard enough to stave in the nose. Between that and the missing turbos, the handover slid from October to January 12, 1945, after the aircraft's 8th flight. Nakajima had already held its acceptance ceremony at Koizumi on Christmas Day. A newsreel crew filmed it, and the footage still exists. The aircraft then went to Opama Airfield near Yokosuka for speed trials, and at Opama it broke. On one landing, the rear fuselage fractured. The blame lay somewhere unexpected. The Navy's own fuselage strength rules were inadequate for aircraft with tricycle gear. The airframe was repaired and partly redesigned. Opama was also too small a field for flying the Renzan at its overload weight of nearly 71,000 pounds, and by early 1945 the Kanto plane was under near continuous attack. So the first 2 prototypes were flown north to Misawa, away from the raids. Between December 1944 and June 1945, Nakajima built 3 more. The second was finished on December 29th and first flew on April 12th. Number 3 was completed on March 26th and flew sometime in June, though the Navy never formally accepted it. The fourth was finished in June as well, and it never flew in Japanese hands. Fuselages for prototypes 5 through 8 stood half-assembled in the shop. They got no further, and the flight test program never had a chance. Koizumi was hit twice in February by carrier aircraft from Task Force 58, then on April 4th by B-29s flying a night precision raid, which did the heaviest damage of all, and again on July 10th by the carriers of Task Force 38. Nakajima's other big plant at Ota, just down the road, had already been gutted by a low-level carrier strike in February that flattened roughly 60% of its buildings. Exactly which raid killed the third Renzan went unrecorded. All anybody knows is that it was destroyed on the ground at Koizumi by Navy carrier planes. The first two didn't survive at Misawa either. American photographs taken after the surrender show the second one with its fuselage torn open by strafing. The sources disagree on whether those two were finished off in July and August or just cannibalized and scrapped. By April, the design team had been moved out of the factory to a girls' high school in Kumagaya. At the end of the war, Nakajima burned what was left of the drawings, which is a big part of why so much about it is still argued over. And then Japan ran out of aluminum. The country had built its whole aluminum industry on bauxite from the Netherlands East Indies, around 90% of it. American submarines closed that route. Bauxite imports fell from 136,000 tons in the second quarter of 1944 to 30,000 in the third, and the national stockpile dropped to 3,000 tons. By the middle of 1945, primary aluminum output was down to 9% of the previous year's peak. A Renzan was expensive in that currency. One of them ate about as much light alloy as 10 zeros. The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that even with no bombing of the home islands, the blockade alone would have pushed Japanese war production 40 to 50% below its 1944 peak by that August. The bombers were finishing off an industry the submarines had already starved. In the end, the Navy killed it. The decision has a date and an address. On June 13, 1945, at a meeting at the company clubhouse at Ota, called to settle which prototype would go into service, the head of Navy Air Headquarters, Vice Admiral Misao Wada, announced that production of the Renzan would stop. The emphasis from here on had to go to special attack aircraft and the new attack aircraft coming behind them, he said. And with gasoline critically short, what fuel remained should be reserved for Homar engines. The same meeting concluded that aluminum stocks would be exhausted by September, or by year's end at the latest, and that everything built in the next fiscal year would have to be made of steel and wood. In practice, the capacity went to the Kika, Nakajima's small twin-jet attacker. The engineers tried to save something out of it. In mid-1945, they put up revised variants. One was the G8N2, a mothership for the Oka Model 33 kamikaze aircraft, with a bigger set of engines, 2,200 horsepower Mitsubishi Mk9As. Oka meant cherry blossom. Allied crews called it the Baka bomb, same word as the crow. The Model 33 was an enlarged version of that piloted flying bomb, powered by the Na-20 turbojet and carrying an 1,800-pound warhead, and the Renzan was picked to carry it once the defeats in the Marianas and the Philippines had made special attack the Navy's main effort. The reason it died is almost circular. The Oka Model 33 was abandoned because it seemed unlikely the Renzan would ever be available to launch it. They also proposed the all-steel G8N3. That meant an airframe in low-alloy steel instead of aluminum, worked up with the Navy's Bureau of Ships. Japanese accounts say the study had been running since 1944. English ones put it in the last weeks before the surrender. Neither one got past paper. Somewhere in all this, the Allies gave the type a reporting name. They called it Rita because female names went to bombers under their naming system. And there was almost nothing behind the name. The Technical Air Intelligence Center's handbook of June 1945 profiled 60 Japanese aircraft from Babs to Zeke. Rita appears in it exactly once, and not as an entry of its own. It turns up in a warning attached to the Oka, listing Rita among the aircraft that might be seen carrying one. There is no Rita data page, no silhouette, no line in the index. Allied intelligence had a name for the Renzan and almost nothing else because there was nothing to observe. No G8N ever flew a combat mission. None were intercepted, none were ever seen in the air by an Allied aircraft, an Allied ship, or a single gun crew. After the war, the Americans shipped the fourth prototype home and evaluated it through the summer of 1946. That fourth airframe had been found at Koizumi damaged and unfinished, and it was Nakajima's own workers who put it back together for the Americans, using parts salvaged from the first two prototypes at Misawa. In December 1945, it was flown from Koizumi to Opama under American supervision, then loaded as deck cargo aboard the escort carrier USS Bogue, which sailed from Yokosuka. It reached New Jersey in January and was barged to Newark Field for reassembly. The Americans gave it a number, FE-2210, later T-22210, and painted it in Army Air Forces markings. On June 23, 1946, it was flown from Newark to Patterson Field, outside Dayton, Ohio, roughly 550 miles into a headwind, a 3-hour, 10-minute trip. One more test flight followed, and then the flying stopped. The reason was the engines. After American mechanics serviced them, only one of the 4 Homares would run at full power. Nobody in the United States ever got a Renzan into the air on 4 good engines, which means nobody on either side of the Pacific ever found out what this aircraft could really do. The airframe was set aside for the Army Air Force's proposed museum at Patterson Field and eventually scrapped there. The scrapping is usually dated to the Korean War years. Nothing of it survives in any collection anywhere. Then, in 2023, 38 panes of glass surfaced in a house in Ora, in Gunma Prefecture, carried out of the Koizumi plant after the surrender by a relative of 2 former Nakajima employees. The man who had them stored them for decades, not knowing what they were, until he recognized the bombardiers glazing in an old local history photograph. The pane that sat in front of the pilot is nearly half an inch thick, armor in glass. They may be the only pieces of a Renzan left in Japan. The American assessment found fault with a whole list of details, but they were minor matters, the kind that crop up on any prototype and get ironed out in time. American specialists were thoroughly impressed by the engineering and craftsmanship of the Japanese bomber. Had aircraft like the G8N entered service even a year earlier, the Allied invasion of Okinawa could have been a far longer and far more costly campaign. But the Renzan was not beaten by anything it met in the air. It never met anything. It was beaten by tolerances Japanese factories could not hold, by turbine alloys the country did not have, and by submarines 1,000 miles away cutting off the bauxite. The bomber was finished long before it was ever flown.